Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I'm covering the very sad case of John and Mary Cox and the murder of Ann Halliday, which took place in the Chesley Street area in 1862. This has turned out to be quite a long story, so I've tried to make it as short as possible, but to still include all of the details. I hope you will find it interesting. Sadly, there is very little information about the past life of John and Mary Cox. John was said to be a pitman working in the Chesley Street area. He was said to be around 25 years old at the time the crime was committed, so would have been born in around 1837. He was born in Ireland and was married to Mary Cox, who had also been born in Ireland. Mary was said to be around 27 years old, so would have been born in around 1835. The couple had one child together, a little girl who was around 1 year old. Ann Halliday, the victim, had been born Ann Scott in around 1780 in Chesley Street to parents Henry and Ann. She had married William Halliday in 1810. It's not clear if the couple had any children together. Anne had been separated from her husband for many years. It was said they had parted ways because of Anne's drinking. However, now in her 80s, she did not drink as much. William had a butcher shop and also ran a public house, so had been able to continue to take care of his wife, and she lived in a cottage in Hobbletrot paid for by her husband. Before we go any further, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It really is very much appreciated. It is completely free to subscribe, it doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And as always, I just want to add that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. On Saturday evening, August the 9th, 1862, Ann Halliday had been to a tea party near to her home where she'd spent some time in the company of several of her neighbours. She'd returned home quite early, and it was believed that she'd gone to bed at her usual hour, and nothing strange was seen in the area by any of her neighbours. In the early hours of Sunday morning, Mary Cox, who lived with her husband John in the cottage next door to Ann at Chesley Street, went in search of help from her neighbours, having found Ann in her cottage in a very bad way. She had been badly beaten and was almost unconscious. Mary had knocked on the door of William Halliday, Ann's husband, who lived close by, and he sent his housekeeper and another lady by the name of Jane Black to see what was wrong. They found Ann in her cottage with John Cox. Ann was able to say a few words, and she spoke of someone in her room in white who had attacked her. A policeman and a doctor were sent for. However, by the time the doctor arrived, Ann had already died from her injuries. PC Christen examined her rooms, and acting on information received, he arrested both John and Mary Cox on a charge of willful murder, and they were taken to the police station. Their baby daughter was taken to the workhouse. The details of the end of the inquest were very hard to find, so I have used the details of the later court hearing as well as the inquest, but all evidence given would have been the same at both. The inquest was held at Nettlesworth, and the court hearing was held at the police courts in Durham. John and Mary Cox were not present at the inquest, but they were present at the court hearing along with their baby daughter. Although no evidence was given as to who had identified the body of Ann Halliday, I think we can assume that her husband would have identified her. John Dawson said he was a miner and lived at Broadmere near Chesley Street. He said at one time he had lived next door to Ann Halliday. He said the walls between the cottages were very thin, and you could hear everything that went on in the neighbour's house. He said he'd last been near to Ann's house on Saturday afternoon of the 9th. He'd been digging up his potatoes from a plot opposite her door. He said he did not see her, but he saw John Cox and another man by the name of Miley talking outside of her house. He said there were also 2 other men in the area, but they had been, like him, simply doing some garden work on their vegetables. Jane Dawson, wife of John, said she had last seen Ann Halliday on the Tuesday before her death. She said Ann had spoken to her and asked her if she knew the man who lived next door to her, meaning John Cox. Jane had said she told her she did not know who he was. She also spoke of the walls between the cottages being very thin. She said she was even able to hear Ann saying her prayers when she went to bed. She said around 14 or 15 years ago, the cottages had all been one house, with a door between the 2 different living areas inside. Robert Simpson said he was a miner living near Chesley Street. He said at around 11:30 p.m. on the 9th he had been passing Ann's house on the way to the well. He said he saw a woman standing near to the Coxes' house. She seemed to stand outside for quite some time, but he could not tell who she was or what she was doing. He said he had also passed several drunken men on the road near Ann's house, but this was not unusual, as many would be walking home that way on a summer's night. Ann Corby, housekeeper to William Halliday, said she was awoken in the early hours of Sunday the 10th, sometime after 4 a.m, by William, who had asked her to go with Mary Cox and see what was wrong with Mrs. Halliday, who Mary had said was dying. She had asked Jane Black to go with her. She said when they arrived they found Ann lying on the floor, propped up by John Cox. She was bleeding quite badly and seemed almost unconscious. She said she had spoken to her and asked her what had happened, and she said Mrs. Halliday replied, "I am murdered, Ann." She said she asked her who had done it, and she replied, "Oh, them Irish," and she seemed to shift her head to look in the direction of the Coxes' house. Ann Corby said someone had asked her if she had fallen out of her bed, and she said she had been dragged from her bed, adding that she had seen a man in white standing at the bottom of her bed before she was attacked. Mary Cox, she said, had told her that Ann had simply taken a dizzy fit and fallen from her bed. P.C. Christian said on the morning of the 10th he was on duty when a man by the name of Robert Kell came to report that Mrs. Halliday was in a bad way at her home near Chesley Street. He said this was at around 4:30 a.m. He said he went there at once, arriving at around 5 a.m. He said by now Ann had been placed on her bed. He said he tried to speak to her but could not understand what she was trying to say. He said he had then asked Ann Corby, who had told her that Mrs. Halliday had been attacked, and she said the people next door. He said he then went into the house belonging to the Coxes and spoke to John, telling him he would need to come back into Mrs. Halliday's house, adding that John did not seem very keen on this idea. He said he took both Mr. and Mrs. Cox and stood them at the bottom of Ann Halliday's bed. He then asked her, "Is this the man that ill-used you?" P.C. Christian said he could not be sure, but he thought that she had said yes. He said he then asked Mary Reid, who was present at the time, to ask Mrs. Halliday what she had said, and he said that she told him that Mrs. Halliday had said yes it was. He said he told John what had been said, and John spoke to Mrs. Halliday saying, "You don't blame me for it, do you?" And he then walked out of the room. He said he followed him and told him that he would have to arrest him and his wife on a charge of ill-using Mrs. Halliday. He said John replied, saying, "If we had been in bed all night, this would not have happened." And his wife stated, "This is what we get for telling people about hearing Ann Halliday cry out in pain." P.C. Christian said it was then that he noticed John had what appeared to be blood on his shirt, and that one leg of his trousers seemed to be wet as if it had just been washed. He said on asking John about the blood, he said he had got this on his shirt when he was helping to carry Ann to her bed. He said he then found a shawl in the house that he later found belonged to Ann Halliday. He said Mary Cox told him that Ann had given her the shawl some time ago. He said he also noticed that the fire in the house was very well made and seemed to be burning very brightly, and Mary said she had just built up the fire, but he felt it had been burning for quite some time. He said on examining the room he believed he found a blood stain on the poker, but he said John Cox did not reply when he questioned him about this. He said he also asked if they had any money in the house, and Mary said they only had around 10pence, but when he searched he found a lot more money than this, some of which seemed to be hidden, some was wrapped in a nightcap. He said he also found an apron covered in blood under the bed, and Mary Cox said it had been used to carry some meat in. He said he did find 3 pieces of raw meat in the house, including some liver. He said he also found a sheet at the bottom of the bed which seemed to have spots of blood on it. He said he then asked John how he had got inside Mrs. Halliday's house, and he said her door was locked, so he'd used the poker to force her door open when he had heard her crying out. He said John took him to the door and pointed the marks out upon it caused by the poker. P.C. Christian said he examined the door later and found other marks on it as if it had been broken open more than once. P.C. Christian said on examining Ann Halliday's home he was shown a coal rake which had blood on it, and he also found a pair of tongs for the fire which seemed to have blood on them, and several patches of blood on the floor, including one area where it seemed as if someone had been trying to clean the blood away. He said later, when both John and Mary were charged with Ann Halliday's willful murder after she had died, they both stated they were innocent. He ended by saying that the wall between the 2 homes was very thin, and anything that went on in either house could be clearly heard in the other. Jane Black from South Shields said she had been stopping with Mr. Halliday and his housekeeper because she was going to help them with a bowls match which was happening that weekend. She said at around 4 a.m. she heard someone knocking at the door. She said Mr. Halliday got up and went to the door, followed by Ann Corby. Mary Cox was at the door and she told them to come at once as Mrs. Halliday was very bad. She said Mr. Halliday asked Ann Corby to go and see what was wrong, and she said she went with her. She said when they entered Mrs. Halliday's house she was on the floor near to the fire and John Cox was holding her up. She had blood all over her face. She said she was able to speak to her and she said she thought her left arm was broken. She said Ann Corby went to find some help and she stayed with Mrs. Halliday. John Cox left and went back to his home, but Mary stayed with her in the room. She said Mary told her that Mrs. Halliday had fallen out of bed. Jane said she asked her this and she replied, "No, they dragged me out." She said she did not point to anyone, but she felt that Mrs. Halliday had meant John and Mary Cox. She said Mrs. Halliday also told her that she had seen a man in white standing at the bottom of her bed before she was attacked, but she did not say anything else. After this, Jane said she found John Cox and asked him to help her to lift Ann into bed, which he did, and he then returned to his home again. She said it was possible that he may have got some blood on his shirt when he helped to lift her into bed. She said Mary Cox told her that she thought Mrs. Halliday was delirious, but she said she did not think that she was. William Halliday said he was a butcher and Ann Halliday was his wife. He said Mary Cox often bought her meat from him and just recently she had bought some liver and some beef. He said he was sure that she always carried the meat home in a towel or on a plate. William said he was also a publican and ran his business close to the home where Ann lived. He said in the early hours of the morning of August the 10th he heard someone knocking on his door. He said at first he thought it was someone looking to buy some drink. He said when he opened his door he found Mary Cox on the step. She said, "The old woman up the road is very bad." He said he asked her who, but she did not say, just repeating that the woman was really bad. He said he asked his housekeeper Ann Corby and Jane Black to go to the house with Mary to see what was wrong. Mary Reid said she had gone to the home of Ann Halliday at around 4:20 a.m. on the morning of the 10th. She said when she arrived, Ann was already in bed. She was badly hurt, but she was able to speak. She said she asked her who had done this to her, and she replied, "Oh, that man." She said the man had taken her by the throat and ill-used her. She had tried to escape, but had not been able to. She said she'd been present when P.C. Christian had asked her who had done it, when John and Mary Cox had also been present. She said she could not remember the exact words Ann had spoken, but she had answered yes to most of the questions she had been asked. She said she had been quite sensible until the end. Sergeant Simpson said on the 10th he had searched the fields near to Ann's cottage and he'd been able to find the front door key. He said he had tried the key in the door and it was the correct key. He said it had been found just opposite the cottage. The coroner then spoke to the jury, stating that in recent days much had been made in the local newspapers of a rumour that a man who had been working on the cottages in recent days had been responsible for the crime. He said the man had been traced and was going to give evidence today. John Smith of Ireland said he had been working on the cottages on behalf of Mr. Jackson. He said he'd been using a ladder to reach higher areas of the cottage. He said he had left the ladder behind as he planned to go back to the cottage on the Monday. However, he said as an Irishman he liked whiskey and he had drunk too much and had not been able to go back to his job. This, it seems, had caused the rumours to begin because people said it was strange that he had not returned the day after the murder. He said he'd heard about the murder on Monday night. He also added that he had been known to get a little tipsy, but had never been drunk in his life. This caused the jury and others present at the inquest to burst into laughter. He ended by saying that he had spent all day on Sunday in Durham, and on Monday he'd been drinking, so he was not going back to work until later, and he added that he had never touched any of the wood that blocked up the upstairs windows when he had been working on the cottage. There had been discussion started by John Cox that someone had entered the home of Ann Halliday via the window mentioned and then entering her rooms by the loft hatch. It was stated that the ladder left by John Smith was near to this window. However, when examined, the window was covered with cobwebs and most of the wooden bars were still in place, blocking it from opening, so this idea was quickly discarded. The police, however, did check the loft hatch, and although the sacking used to block the drafts from the hatch seemed to have been moved a little, they were perfectly sure that no one had entered Mrs. Halliday's rooms by these means. Dr. Hudson of Chester Street said he had first seen Ann Halliday a little after 7 a.m. on the 10th. He said he'd been sent for at 6 a.m, but by the time he arrived, Ann had already died, and she'd been dead for around 30 minutes. He had noticed that she had bruises all over her body, her left arm was broken, and there was a fracture to the skull. He said along with Dr. Linton, he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of Ann Halliday. He said apart from the fracture to the skull, Ann also had 4 broken ribs which had penetrated the lungs. He said it was his professional opinion that the cause of death had been the fracture to the skull and the broken ribs. He added that Ann would have been able to talk almost up until her death, although he felt she may have been suffering from shock from the blows, but she would have been able to understand and answer any questions put to her before her death. He ended by saying that most of the injuries could have been caused by the coal rake if used with great violence. Dr. Linton did not give any evidence. P.C. Banks said he'd been called to Ann Halliday's house on the morning of the 10th. He said by the time he arrived, Ann was already dead. He said he'd gone into the Coxes' house and spoken to the couple. He said the house was in much disarray, with water on the floor, and when he looked at the fire, it seemed as if it had been used to burn something such as clothing. He said a short time later he asked John Cox how he had not heard such a brutal attack take place in the rooms next door when the walls were so thin. He said John then made a statement, which he then read out. I went to bed at around 10 p.m. At 3:30 a.m. I heard the woman next door shouting and moaning. I woke my wife and asked her to go and see what was wrong. She asked me to go, and I went outside and looked in the window. Ann Halliday shouted for me to break the window or break the door in as it was locked, but I did not do this. I then told my wife to go to Mr. Halliday's house and tell him to come and see what was wrong. All the time Ann was still shouting for me to break the door in, so I took the poker with me and forced the door off its hinges. I found her on the floor covered in blood. She said a man in white had attacked her. When the other women arrived, Mrs. Black asked me to help to lift Ann back into her bed, and I got blood on my clothing while I was doing this. P.C. Banks said Mary Cox had agreed that this statement was the truth. He said after this he had asked John where the poker was, and he said it was beside the fire. He said to him it seemed to have a small amount of blood on it, which had been the same as what P.C. Christian had thought, but John had told him he may have had blood on his hands when he returned with it after lifting Ann into her bed. A written piece of evidence had been read which stated that several days prior to her death, Ann Halliday had spoken to a man by the name of Mr. Foster, telling him that she had some strange neighbours. adding that she would suffer at the hands of the Irish. It was noted that John and Mary Cox were both Irish, but it was also noted that Mrs. Halliday, for no real reason, had a deep fear of Irish people. This, it seems, was not something new. She had feared the Irish for many years. At the court hearing, both John and Mary were asked if they had anything to say, and both said they were innocent of the crime they were charged with. And the inquest had already returned a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against both John and Mary, and the magistrates now agreed with this verdict and officially committed the couple for trial. I did not find any evidence of a funeral for Ann Halliday. However, I assume in this case that her husband, being a man of means, would have paid for her burial just as he had paid for her to live in the cottage. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Ann anywhere in the area. The trial took place in Durham in December of 1862 before Mr. Justice Keaton. Both John and Mary Cox pleaded not guilty to the charge. In this case, a lot of new evidence was given and some statements were made which I will include as follows. Ann Halliday said Mrs. Halliday was her aunt. She said she had gone to her home on the morning of the 10th. She said when she arrived she was perfectly able to talk. She had asked her what had happened and she had told her that it was, "Oh, them bad villains, they have ill-used me, but I will pray for them." She said she was present when P.C. Christian had brought John Cox to her bedside, but she had not heard any of the questions he had asked her aunt. However, she said she did hear John Cox ask her aunt if he had not helped her into bed, and her aunt had replied that yes, he had. William Halliday also made a further statement where he said he had mistakenly suggested that his wife was known to take dizzy fits. He said this was now not true. He also said that after his housekeeper had left to check on his wife, John Cox had come to his house and asked him to come to the cottage. He said that John said Anne was dying and he had told him that he could not help with anything to do with that. He said he did not recall asking if his wife had been drinking. He said he could not say that she was addicted to drink, but she did like to drink when she was younger. He said John told him he thought she had fallen from her bed. Inspector Thompson said he had inspected the loft in Anne's house. He did find some boards had been removed from the window frame, but he said these boards could not have been removed from the outside. The nails holding them in place were all internal. Dr. Donkin, medical scientist, said he had been sent the poker, coal rake and clothes to examine. He said he'd found nothing on the poker, but on the clothing belonging to John Cox he had found various spots and smears of blood that appeared to be human. When asked by the judge, he stated he could not confirm this was human blood, as some animal blood looked very similar when dry. He said he found some marks of blood on the coal rake. It was stated that a test had been done at the cottages where someone had lightly tapped the bedpost in Anne's home to see if it could be heard in the Coxes, and it was clearly heard. This led the prosecution to believe that it would not be possible for the Coxes to hear nothing if a vicious attack had taken place in Anne's home, and the fact that they claimed to have at one point not gone to bed, then they would have been awakened when it happened. However, they had later stated they had gone to bed, but such an attack, he said, would have also awoken them both from their sleep. It was also stated that the only motive for the attack could have been the idea that Ann Halliday kept money in her home. However, she had very little. But the Coxes had claimed to have only a few pennies, but when their home was searched, a lot more money was found hidden in various places. And finally it was stated that there appeared to be evidence that clothing had been burnt on the fire in the Coxes' home. This, it was thought, had been clothes worn during the attack, and which would explain only a small amount of blood being found on John Cox the following morning. The defence spoke to the jury, stating that the evidence they had heard so far had all mostly been circumstantial. There was no clear proof that John Cox and his wife had been the people who had attacked Ann Halliday. He said it was clear that they had both tried to help Mrs. Halliday. Mary had even gone out in her nightdress in the early hours to seek assistance. The blood on the clothing was of such a small amount as to truly have been something added when John helped to lift Mrs. Halliday into her bed. And there was also no real evidence that any clothing had been burnt. In fact, Mrs. Cox was still wearing the same clothes she had worn to raise the alarm when the police had first arrived. And the apron with blood on it had been found, which surely would have been the first thing burnt. And, he said, they must also think of the statement made by Ann Halliday that a man in white had attacked her. She did not say this man was John Cox. And he also stated that the only true item belonging to Ann Halliday found in the Coxes' home was her shawl, and who would leave that in clear view if they know they had stolen it? He did not speak at any time of the role Mary Cox had allegedly played in the murder. He ended by saying that the jury must think carefully before they made their decision in this case. I just want to add a tiny little piece in here, and that is the fact that during the trial, some liver which was said to be found in the Coxes' house had been examined, and I can't really understand why they had examined the liver. I just find that to be extremely bizarre. Anyway, the judge, in summing up, stated it was seen in these cases that if a wife was present when a crime was committed, then she was just as guilty as the husband. They must also consider the statement made by Ann Halliday of a man in white at her bedside, would she not have said Irishman if she meant her neighbours? He said it was for the jury to decide if they felt that John Cox was indeed responsible for the crime and that his wife had in some way helped to cover the crime up. If they felt this, then it must be a verdict of murder. If they felt it had been an accident, then it must be manslaughter. If they, however, felt it was some other person, then they must find not guilty. The jury retired for 2 hours and 15 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against John Cox. They were then asked their judgment on Mary Cox, to which they stated they felt she had been aware of the crime and had done nothing to stop it, and that they also found her guilty of wilful murder. The judge then addressed both John and Mary and stated that they'd been found guilty of a most dreadful crime and they would both be sentenced to death by hanging, and that their remains would be buried within the grounds of Durham Prison. The courtroom then erupted with many people wailing and crying, not least of all Mary Cox, who continued to protest her innocence of both herself and her husband. Almost immediately after the courtroom had been silenced, the judge asked if Mary Cox was with child. The female warder said she claimed she was. The judge then ordered her to be examined. After this, it was stated that she was indeed in a far advanced state of pregnancy. The judge then ordered that her sentence be commuted to one of penal servitude for life. The prisoners were then removed from the dock. A petition was started to commute the sentence to one of penal servitude of life for John Cox on the grounds that the evidence he had been convicted on was purely circumstantial. However, the Home Secretary, Sir Charles Grey, stated that the inquiry had been full and proper and the execution would go ahead as planned. The execution of John Cox took place on December the 23rd, 1862, and the hangman was Thomas Erskine. It was said that the night before the execution, John had slept well until 5 a.m. when he had got up and dressed. However, he had taken to his bed again after this and did not get back up until 7 a.m. He was attended by the Reverend Platt, who stayed with him until the end. John was pinioned, his hands were tied behind his back, and he was then led to the scaffold. He was said to show great signs of fear and was shaken quite badly on his walk. On reaching the drop, the Reverend Platt raised his hand to the watching crowd, and many of them knelt down in prayer. The cap was placed over John's head, the rope was adjusted, and the signal was given. The bolt was removed, and John fell. His death was said to be almost instant. The crowd who had witnessed the hanging slowly left the scene, and after the usual time of 1 hour, the body was removed and placed into a plain wooden coffin, and later buried within the grounds of Durham Prison. It was said that Mary Cox had been in a desperate state on the morning of the execution, and as soon as the bell signalling the start of the procession to the scaffold began to ring, she had wept badly and cried out that her husband was innocent. And it was also stated that on the same day her brother had come to the prison to ask what could be done about his sister's child. She'd been living with his family, but he stated he was no longer able to keep her. He had children of his own, and although he was allowed money for her keep, he had to travel a long distance to collect this money, which he could not continue to do. Sadly, I did not find any further evidence for Mary or her child after this date. I do not know which prison Mary was sent to, or if she was ever released and able to take care of her daughter and her, at the time of her trial, unborn child. Sadly, it seems her daughter may have ended up in the workhouse, and if Mary was released, she may never have been able to find her. This was a very sad and strange case. I have struggled to find any clear evidence to suggest that John and Mary were indeed guilty of the crime, although many things seem to point in their direction based on what many of the witnesses said. Neither ever confessed to the crime, and no real motive ever came to light. Anne herself did not state the man at the bottom of her bed was the man from the house next door, and although many said she did say it was him, no one seems to have clearly heard her make this statement. However, it also has to be noted that all sounds between the two cottages could be clearly heard. So if someone had broken into Anne's home and attacked her, then the Cox family would have heard them, yet they claimed to have heard nothing until Anne began to shout for help. Although it is possible they did sleep through any noise, this does not seem to have been considered, and the fact they heard nothing seems to have gone against them, with most saying they heard nothing, as it was them who committed the crime. The evidence was very basic: a few small marks of blood, the suggestion that clothing had been burnt, a small amount of money found hidden in the house, and a shawl belonging to Anne hanging in the home of the Coxes. Was this really enough to find them guilty? The locked door and the lost key do not make much sense either. Would someone hiding their crime really think to do this and then break into the home using the same poker that the first police officer thought had been used in the attack? Even Anne's statements before her death when she spoke of the Irish may not have been suggestion they did it, but just a continuation of her fear of the Irish and not wanting them in her home. I have to admit that I cannot fully find enough evidence to suggest that John and Mary were truly guilty of the crime. Were the jury correct to find them both guilty of murder? Well, as I say, I don't think so, and I have to admit that if I'd been on the jury, I would have had doubts and not been able to find them guilty. But I think the jury were perhaps swayed by the money found when the Coxes said they had little to no money, and the belief that the police really did say burnt clothing in the fire, things that did make them look guilty. Mary, being pregnant at the time, was lucky to escape with her life, but she lost her husband and most likely both of her children. And as said earlier, no confession was ever made by either Mary or John. Of course, it is 100% clear that Ann Halliday was murdered that fateful night, but was it possible that someone else was responsible? The jury at the inquest were very quick to take the word of the Irish worker who left his ladder behind and claimed to have been drinking all weekend without questioning him any further. And I somehow feel that the true murderer of Ann Halliday may never be known. But what do you think? Do you think John and Mary were the ones responsible for the death of Ann Halliday? Or do you think they truly had only been trying to help when they heard her shouting for help? Do you think it is possible the Irish workman John Smith assumed Anne had money and he returned to find it, was caught and attacked her? Or possibly someone else who believed she had money in her home? Do you think the jury were correct to find them both guilty of murder, or do you think there should have been some element of doubt? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting. It has been a lot longer than I was expecting it to be, and I think I have kind of struggled in a couple of places because my complete and desperate desire at this moment is to have a drink because my mouth has dried out. Something chronic reading for such a long length of time. But hopefully I've got through it making enough sense for you to understand it, and I do hope that you have enjoyed it. I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again next week.